Ask anyone what happened on October 8th, 1871, and they'll tell you about the Great Chicago Fire. Mrs. O'Leary's cow, the barn, the city burning. It's one of the most famous disaster stories in American history, taught in schools, referenced in movies, embedded in the cultural memory of a nation. Here's what almost nobody tells you. On that exact same night, October 8th, 1871, a fire started in the forests of northeastern Wisconsin. Same date, same hour, roughly. And that fire killed somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 people. The Chicago Fire killed about 300. The fire in Wisconsin, the Peshtigo Fire, killed up to 8 times as many people as the event that everyone remembers. It burned through 1.2 million acres. It destroyed 12 communities. It produced fire phenomena that scientists still study today because they had never been documented before and haven't been seen at the same scale since. And you probably haven't heard of it. That's not an accident. That's what happens when a smaller, more famous disaster happens on the same night in a bigger, more important city. Chicago was the story. Peshtigo was a footnote. And a footnote it has remained for over 150 years. Which is exactly why we're here today. Chapter 2. The Town at the Edge of the Forest. Peshtigo, Wisconsin, 1871. A lumber town. Population around 2,000 people, though the surrounding area had significantly more when you counted the logging camps and small settlements scattered through the forest. The town itself sat at the mouth of the Peshtigo River, surrounded on almost every side by the kind of dense, old-growth forest that used to cover much of the upper Midwest. The economy was timber, woodenware, wooden tubs, wooden dishes, wooden handles, was manufactured in the town's factory, one of the largest woodenware factories in the country at the time. Which means that Peshtigo was not just surrounded by wood. It was built of wood. Its industry was wood, and its economy depended on the continued harvesting of wood from the forests that surrounded it on every side. This matters for what happened next. The summer and fall of 1871 had been extraordinarily dry across the entire upper Midwest. It hadn't rained significantly in months. The forests were not just dry. They were critically dry, in the way that foresters today would recognize as extreme fire danger conditions. The forest floor was covered in years of accumulated dead leaves, fallen branches, dried moss. The undergrowth hadn't seen significant moisture since spring. Logging operations had left debris everywhere. Cut branches, sawdust, bark, piled in the clearings and along the railroad lines that ran through the timber country. The railroad itself was a regular source of sparks. Small fires had been burning in the surrounding forests for weeks, smoldering at the edges, kept in check not by any human effort, but simply by the fact that no major wind had pushed them yet. Everyone knew the forest was dry. Everyone could smell the smoke that drifted through town on most days. But small fires were normal. They happened every year. They had always, eventually, gone out. Chapter 3. What changed on October 8th? On the evening of October 8th, 1871, the wind changed. A cold front moving across the Great Lakes brought strong, gusting winds from the southwest. The kind of winds that can take a smoldering fire and turn it into something that moves faster than a man can run. The small fires that had been burning for weeks in the forests around Peshtigo suddenly had fuel and air. They merged, they grew, and they began to move toward the town. What happened next is where the Peshtigo Fire becomes something different from most historical fires. Something that belongs as much in a science textbook as in a history book. This is a good moment, if you haven't already. Subscribe to the channel. What comes next is the part of this story that most people have never heard. And it's the part that genuinely surprised me when I was researching it. The Peshtigo Fire, at its peak intensity, generated what scientists now call a fire whirl, sometimes referred to as a fire tornado. As the fire grew large enough and hot enough, it began to create its own weather system. The heat rising from the burning forest pulled in surrounding air from every direction, creating massive inward winds that fed the fire more oxygen and caused it to burn hotter and faster than any natural process should allow. Temperatures inside the fire reached estimates of over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That is hot enough to melt glass, hot enough to incinerate a human body so completely that no remains are left. Survivors, and there weren't many from the areas closest to the fire's center, described the sky turning red and then orange, and then a kind of white that they didn't have words for. They described the sound as something between a roar and a scream, coming from everywhere at once. They described the air itself becoming impossible to breathe, not because of smoke, but because the fire was consuming the oxygen in the atmosphere around them. The fire moved at speeds estimated up to 100 miles per hour in its most intense phase. There was no outrunning it. Chapter 4. The night Peshtigo died. The fire reached Peshtigo shortly after 9 p.m. on October 8th. The town burned in approximately 1 hour. In that hour, between 800 and 1,200 people in Peshtigo alone died, out of a population of roughly 2,000. That's somewhere between 40 and 60% of the entire town, gone in 60 minutes. The survivors who left written accounts describe making split-second decisions that determined whether they lived or died. Some ran for the river. The Peshtigo River ran through the middle of town and stood in the water while the fire passed over them. Some made it. Some were overcome by smoke or by the superheated air before they reached the water. A Catholic priest named Father Pernin had been in Peshtigo that night. He wrote one of the most detailed survivor accounts that exists from the fire. He described trying to save the church's tabernacle, then realizing the fire was moving too fast, then running for the river with his congregation. He made it to the river. He stood in the water for hours while the fire consumed the town around him. He wrote that the people in the river were being hit by burning debris carried by the wind, that the water itself, at the edges where it was shallow, was warming from the heat of the surrounding fire, that people were praying and crying, and some were simply silent, in a way that he found more frightening than the screaming. By the time the fire had passed, there was nothing left of Peshtigo, not a single building standing. The woodenware factory that had been the economic heart of the town, gone. The church, gone. The houses, the businesses, the hotel, all of it reduced to ash, and in some cases, to nothing at all. The cemetery was one of the few things that survived, which meant that in the days after the fire, survivors used the cemetery's grounds as a staging area for the mass burial of the dead, burying hundreds of victims in a single communal grave, because there was no other way to handle the scale of what had happened. Chapter 5. Beyond Peshtigo. The town of Peshtigo was the center of the disaster, but it wasn't the only place that burned. The fire complex that burned through northeastern Wisconsin and into the upper peninsula of Michigan on the night of October 8th and into the following days consumed communities across a wide area. Sugarbush, Marinette, Brussels, Robinsonville, where a small congregation sheltered in their church and prayed as the fire approached, and where, by accounts that were reported at the time and later investigated as a possible miracle, the church survived while the forest around it burned. Door County, the peninsula that juts into Lake Michigan, lost several communities. People fled to the lake itself and stood in the water, the same instinct that saved some people in Peshtigo, the understanding that water was the only barrier between them and the fire. In the logging camps scattered through the forests, workers had almost no warning and almost no chance. The camps were deep in the timber, surrounded on all sides by exactly the kind of fuel the fire needed. Many of the men in those camps were never found. Their deaths were never officially counted because their existence in the census was incomplete. Transient workers, immigrants, men who had come to Wisconsin for the logging season without their families, without addresses, without records that would allow anyone to confirm afterward that they had been there. This is one of the reasons the death toll of the Peshtigo Fire remains uncertain. The official estimate is around 1,500 to 2,500 dead across the full fire complex. Some historians believe the real number was higher, that the uncounted workers in the logging camps pushed the true total above 2,500. We'll probably never know with certainty. What we know is that it was the deadliest wildfire in American history, by a significant margin. The second deadliest, the Thumb Fire of 1,881 in Michigan, killed around 282 people. Peshtigo killed somewhere between 5 and 9 times that many. Chapter 6. Why Nobody Came. In the days after the fire, Peshtigo needed help. The survivors, those who had made it to the river, those who had been in areas just outside the fire's path, those who had somehow found shelter, were without food, without shelter, without medicine. In the Wisconsin autumn, with winter approaching. There were hundreds of injured people. There were thousands of dead who needed to be buried. Help was slow to arrive. The reason, in large part, was Chicago. The Great Chicago Fire had burned on the same night, and Chicago was a city of 300,000 people, the economic hub of the Midwest, a place that the entire country had heard of and cared about. The news coverage, what passed for news coverage in 1871, was dominated by Chicago from the moment the fire was reported. The relief efforts, the donations, the government attention, the newspaper column inches, all of it went to Chicago first. Peshtigo, when it was covered at all, was a sidebar, a smaller story in the shadow of a bigger one. Governor Lucius Fairchild of Wisconsin was in Chicago when the fires occurred. He had gone there to assist with relief efforts for the Chicago disaster. His wife, Frances Fairchild, actually organized much of the initial relief effort for Peshtigo herself, gathering supplies and coordinating aid from Madison, while her husband was occupied in Illinois. The federal government's response was minimal. There was no FEMA in 1871. There was no structured federal disaster relief system. Communities were largely dependent on private charity and state government, and both were stretched by the simultaneous demands of 2 major disasters in the same week. The people of Peshtigo received help eventually, but the gap between when they needed it and when it arrived was measured in days, during which people who had already survived a catastrophic fire were dying of exposure and untreated injuries. Chapter 7. The Science of What Happened. I want to spend a few minutes on something that I think gets overlooked in most tellings of the Peshtigo story, and it's the reason the fire shows up in scientific literature as well as historical accounts. The Peshtigo Fire was, as far as we know, the first documented occurrence of what's now called a firestorm. A fire intense enough to create and sustain its own weather system, including its own wind patterns, that then feed the fire further in a self-reinforcing cycle. This phenomenon was later observed and studied in the context of the firebombing campaigns of World War II, the Allied bombing of Dresden in 1945, the American firebombing of Tokyo in 1945. Military planners had deliberately attempted to create firestorm conditions in those attacks, using Peshtigo and other large wildfires as part of the theoretical framework for understanding how fires behave at extreme scale. The fire whirls that formed during Peshtigo, visible as rotating columns of flame that moved through the burning forest, were documented by survivors and later analyzed by researchers as early examples of a phenomenon that fire scientists now understand much better. Modern wildfire management takes firestorm dynamics into account when assessing risk and planning suppression strategies. In other words, what happened in the Wisconsin forests in 1871 contributed, indirectly, to how we understand and manage wildfires today. The science that came out of studying events like Peshtigo is part of what allows modern firefighters to make better decisions about when to fight and when to retreat. The people who died in Peshtigo didn't know they were contributing to a body of scientific knowledge. They were just trying to survive a fire that moved faster than anything they had ever seen or imagined. But the knowledge is real, and it came from what happened to them. Chapter 8. What was lost and what remained. The town of Peshtigo was rebuilt, not immediately and not easily, but within a few years, new buildings had gone up on the same ground, new families had arrived, and the lumber economy had resumed. The forest, eventually, grew back. The river still runs through what is now the town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin. Today, Peshtigo has a population of around 3,600 people. There's a museum, the Peshtigo Fire Museum, that maintains the historical record of the disaster and serves as a memorial to those who died. There's a mass grave in the cemetery where hundreds of unidentified victims were buried in the days after the fire. There's a marker, there's a museum exhibit, and there's a community that knows its own history, even if the rest of the country doesn't. What was lost and not recovered was simpler to describe. The people. The families that had settled in the timber country, that had built lives in the logging camps and small towns of northeastern Wisconsin. Many of them left no descendants in the region. The lines ended on October 8, 1871. Names that appear in the records before the fire don't appear afterward. Whole family groups, gone. There's a particular kind of historical loss that comes from events like this. Not just the people who died, but the futures they didn't have. The children who would have grown up and had children of their own. The communities that would have developed differently if the people who built them had survived. You can't quantify that loss, but it's real, and it sits underneath the historical record in a way that numbers alone don't capture. Chapter 9. The October 8th Question. Here's something that historians and scientists have debated for over a century without fully resolving it. The Great Chicago Fire and the Peshtigo Fire started on the same night. So did several other fires across the upper Midwest. Fires in Michigan. Fires along the shores of Lake Michigan. Fires that together made October 8, 1871, one of the most catastrophic fire days in American history. That's a lot of fires to start on the same night. The conventional explanation is the drought. The entire region had been abnormally dry for months, and the cold front that came through on October 8th brought strong winds that turned multiple smoldering situations into active disasters simultaneously. But some researchers have proposed a more unusual explanation. The Biela's comet theory suggests that fragments of a comet that had broken apart in the 1840s may have passed through Earth's atmosphere on October 8, 1871, scattering incendiary material across a wide area and igniting fires in multiple locations at once. The theory has never been proven and is considered fringe by most mainstream historians. But it gets raised periodically, and the coincidence of timing genuinely is unusual enough that serious researchers have looked at it more than once. I'm not endorsing the comet theory. I think the drought and wind explanation is almost certainly correct. But I find it interesting that the question gets asked at all. that the scale of what happened on October 8, 1871, is unusual enough that some people have found themselves looking for an explanation beyond the ordinary. Sometimes the ordinary explanation is the right one. A dry summer, a cold front, a strong wind, and decades of accumulated fuel in the forests. Sometimes the conditions just align in the worst possible way, and a catastrophe happens. October 8, 1871, was one of those days. Just not in the city that everyone remembers. Chapter 10. One Last Thing. The Great Chicago Fire gets the movies, the songs, the museum, the cultural memory. Peshtigo gets a small museum in a town of 3,600 people, and a Wikipedia article that most Americans will never read. I've thought a lot about why that disparity exists, and the honest answer is that it comes down to where the fire happened and who it happened to. Chicago was important. Peshtigo was not. Not in the way that the machinery of national attention defines importance in 1871, or, honestly, today. The people who died in Peshtigo were loggers and farm workers and recent immigrants and families who had come to Wisconsin for the timber economy. They were not famous. They were not wealthy. Their deaths didn't have the same impact on commerce, on politics, on the national narrative that the Chicago Fire had. And so they were forgotten. Not maliciously, just gradually, quietly forgotten. The way that most history is forgotten when there isn't someone to keep telling it. That's what this channel exists to do. If this is the first video of ours you've watched, welcome. If you've been here for a while, thank you. Either way, if you found this story worth an hour of your evening, a like and a subscription means these stories reach more people who haven't heard them yet. And if the Peshtigo Fire brought up something you want to talk about, a question, a connection to your own family history, something you knew that I didn't cover, the comments are open, and I genuinely read them. The people of Peshtigo deserved to be remembered. Better late than never. Take care of yourselves out there.